to sort of analyze how Magic was able to survive and continue growing its player base for 30 years is crazy.
Yeah.
Distraction makers.
We feel like there's three primary things that Magic does that sort of ends up influencing you, and it changes the grooves of your brain in a way, probably forever. That makes it like changes your language that you use. It changes. Suddenly you can't hold cards anymore without doing this. Like it's something about Magic, that makes you do this.
We often sort of boil down Magic to its most simple elements, where you have actually playing the game, you have deck building, and then you have the thing that informs the deck building, which is the meta, right? So the meta informs the deck building informs the play, and we refer to these as playing the game as tactics, deck building is strategy, and then meta is meta. And so when you understand that whatever it is that you're designing exists within all of these spaces, it informs the way that you put together a game, right? Whether that's you building a deck in Magic, or whether that's building your own game. And whether or not you are considering it when you're building a Magic deck, you are creating an experience for the people that you're playing with or against, right? And so going through that process and learning all those pieces starts to make it so that if you wanted to, you could take those skills that you're learning, whether or not you're paying attention to them or not, and then apply them to a game that you are creating.
Right.
And it doesn't even really matter if it's a card game or not. Like these are things that you like, pieces of a game that you need to be thinking about, and you might not even understand that they exist had you not played Magic in sort of these ways.
Yeah.
Playing Magic teaches you how to be a game designer, and anyone playing Magic inherently then is a game designer, right? And
without realizing it, most people are game designers.
Dungeons and Dragons also does this.
Yes, those are the two.
That's kind of like what we joke about is like, okay, well, if you're a game designer in the industry, you either came from Dungeons and Dragons or you came from Magic. Now that's that's kind of a boomer mentality a little bit, because there's lots of other games that have influenced designers. But
I love talking to other people at board game nights and telling them like Magic the Gathering and Dungeons and Dragons started every game ever.
Right.
And they're like, whatever. And we were playing a deck builder, and I was like, Dominion.
Yeah.
Dominion was inspired by Magic the Gathering draft systems, admittedly, which became the first deck builder that then spawned other deck builders into Ascension, which changed the drafting format. And
and if
everything can go back to Magic.
Yeah, if you trace any card game back, it ends up back at Magic the Gathering because it was the first one.
Yeah.
But it's not just that it was the first card game. It's that it's a card game that has been continually iterated on by a similar collection of people for over 30 years.
30 years.
And so it's a really good resource to look towards for ideas. And if there's something that you can do with a deck of cards that evokes a particular feeling, Magic's probably done it.
Yeah. With Magic in particular, it's something about when you start playing it. I mean it when I think that suddenly it influences your entire outlook on design, and that you said it's not even a card game, and I think that's incredibly true. That playing Magic and getting more invested in it, whether I'm making a board game, a card game, or even looking at video games, it starts to change your design language. And that I remember when we started talking more about action RPGs, and we were playing a lot at that time, and we were like, oh, this is Magic. This is deck building.
Right.
Creating your character and customizing them in an action RPG, the way that most action RPGs are presented currently in the industry, is just deck building in Magic. And suddenly when you look at it through that lens, now you become suddenly much better at it. And I think you start to see a lot of these things that Magic has influenced in our culture and in game design in general, and the things that it generally touches on, which is you have variance in your set of things to customize with. You have variance of output of what you're given on your turn, and you have variance in if it's a PvP game and what your opponents are going to do, or in a PvE game what the AI is going to do. And it still comes down to meta strategy and tactics. Everything can be boiled down to that. Magic, it's much easier to understand because it chunks that information. It's a turn-based strategy game, and you can look at it from an outside viewpoint in a slower paced way and understand what's happening each step of the way.
That's a good point. Yeah, especially because like if you're trying to analyze this stuff, like let's just say you're playing an action RPG and you're just in the moment and you're so focused on playing it and everything's in real time, just sort of a wash over you.
Yeah.
You're not really having that opportunity to stop and really consider like what is happening here, right? You can do it, but I think you need to consciously make that effort. Where Magic, you're right, it puts you in that state. You are interacting with the game on a turn-by-turn basis, on a action-by-action basis that really helps you understand like, oh, this is how this type of interaction plays out, right? And, you know, one thing, I don't think I brought this up yet. The other thing, you know, we mentioned how Magic having been around for as long as it has, and playing Magic for a long period of time gives you an experience in different play patterns, different how systems can evoke different feelings, and those come out as play patterns.
Yeah,
it feels much different to play red aggro than it does to play Drago style control.
Yeah,
you know, I think most people know what red aggro is. It's a very aggressive deck. You're trying to kill your opponent as quickly as possible. Drago is you trying to basically do as little as possible for a much longer period of time. Those are like two opposite ends of the spectrum, basically.
Red aggro decks tend to play very similarly, but depending on the meta, sometimes maybe it's going to be more spell heavy, and other times maybe it's going to be more creature heavy, and it's going to have more of a board presence. And then other colors, you know, sometimes there's like white aggro. And that's going to also have a significantly different feeling.
And because of the colors of Magic, you're right. You're getting these expressions of a greater archetype in how it can feel different based on the philosophies of the color that it's existing in. Like you can have aggro in any color, but it feels much different depending upon what color it's in.
Yeah.
And so I think really you start to wrap your head around how mechanics and systems can evoke feelings in a player, and that's like the foundational building blocks of building an experience for someone. And we touched on it earlier that when you are building a deck, you are creating an experience. When you are playing the game, you're creating an experience. And I think what's so interesting about Commander, this is the best thing about Commander. This is what Commander does that is better, I think.
You heard it here first, folks. Gavin likes Commander. He loves it.
I'm not going to go that far. But
all right.
what I will say is that Commander creates space for new ways of playing Magic. In that when you are playing 1v1 competitive Magic, and it's not to say that Commander is the only format that does this, let's be real. Yeah. You can play 60-card multiplayer Magic. We did that before Commander existed.
Right.
And it was also this way, where there was an opportunity for different types of experiences to be had, where if you're playing 1v1 competitive, you're very much focused on winning the game. And whatever your strategy is, whatever you're doing is focused on how do I win? Yeah. What experience am I creating here?
What is my deck's goal? How is it going to reach that victory condition?
Right. And the experience that you're creating is a consequence of trying to win the game. Where in Commander, there's space available for, well, my priority might not be to win the game. My priority might be to create some kind of, create some kind of interesting experience for the other players that I'm playing with.
Yeah.
When somebody's got to win the game, that's what Magic is. And I think that's almost the tension of Commander that bothers me so much, is that like
you're talking about positive stuff.
I know.
You're talking about good stuff. You can't. We got to pull you back. Pull you back.
Okay. All right. But that's the tension that bothers me, is that Magic at its core is not a game built to do that.
Right.
And Commander sort of is putting an artifice over the top of Magic, saying, well, we're not going to worry about that stuff for now. And like, I don't know. I think it should just be its own game, but that's a separate conversation.
So it's something that we talk about often. It's a criticism that we have of Commander, which is that like everyone's deck is a 7.
Sure.
For those that aren't in on the joke, a 7 is in a 7 out of 10 as far as like how good it is.
Right.
The problem with having any sort of an obscure scale like that, it's not quantifiable. So technically, anyone could think their deck is a 7 when in reality it's a 2 or it's a 10. Or
well,
whatever.
right, and there's been people that have tried to put charts together and things that are like, well, if these things are in your deck, this type of strategy is what you're playing, then that puts it in this rank or whatever.
And that's just not. It's never going to happen like that. But what it means is that when Commander players get together and they decide that they're going to try and use this scale and that they're going to all play 7 out of 10s, that is them designing an experience. That's them understanding that I have this deck. It is not the best deck, but it does this particular thing this well. And so if we all collectively want this play experience at the table, then we can all bring these decks that we have designed and design that table experience.
Yeah.
And that is designing. That's what they're doing when they do that.
Yeah. And it's interesting because I'm very curious to see what kind of game designers come out of having played a Commander experience versus
I think we're already seeing it.
Yeah.
I think we're seeing a rise in a lot of free-for-all multiplayer card games.
Sure.
Yeah.
But I mean more in terms of the breadth of experience you can get out of that rather than, okay, well, 1v1 is very like, okay, we're against each other, me versus you. And it's very, like that experience is limited, right?
Yeah.
Because, that you like I said, the experience is almost a consequence of you just trying to win the game.
Yeah.
And I think that it's actually interesting because when you see Wizards of the Coast start to design for Commander a little bit, you can see this mentality creeping into Commander slightly, right? Early on, where their idea was, oh, well, we just print like better and better cards. And then we're trying to make sure that like we're giving people what we think they want, which is optimization, but it's not, right? You have something like Arcane Signet. And this is even something that Gavin Verhey brings up as like a mistake, right? Which is that, we're thinking of this in a very similar way to 1v1 Magic, where players want to be playing optimally when that's not true.
Yeah.
And so creating these cards that end up being like best in slot, they just start making decks homogenize. So over time, you've seen them move away from it. There's other problems, but like that's the...
Man, such a short-lived positive Commander time.
I mean, look...
This isn't a Commander video.
I know.
Talking about design.
I'm probably going to cut a bunch of this out, but...
Okay, so we have a video. It might be out, might not be out, and it's about cruft, which cruft is a term that we're using for like added components to a game, that added clutter, complexity, even things that might not be necessary for a game to have. So the ring tempts you is an example of cruft in Magic, or is dungeon cards venturing into the dungeon. Another example of cruft in Magic. Technically, tokens, an example of that. But something that Magic has been able to do that I think a lot of people can, I think many designers should glean from this, is that for 30 years, Magic has been able to do a lot of design with not a lot of added components.
Right. With a deck of cards, don't get me wrong, they've had creature tokens for a long time. But, then we get treasures and we get clues and food and whatever. But, I think that might be... To sort of analyze how Magic was able to survive and continue growing its player base for 30 years is crazy.
Yeah. And no other game has done it.
No.
No other game has been around for 30 plus years that has had to forcefully innovate. What was their initial release schedule? It was like...
at some point their cadence was four a year. It was every 3 months. And they maintained that for a very long period of time.
And that's insane. Because when you compare it to any sort of a video game, obviously a lot more work has to be gone into the development of a video game. But I think that's why Magic is such a great thing for designers to be looking at, and for players to really understand and get a sense of design, is because when you have, it's like design at its core, right? It's design without the fluff. And a lot of video games rely very heavily on what we described as the toy, which is, it's, if you're a character running around in a 3D space, that's you playing with a toy, essentially, right? It's not necessarily doing the actions or interactions of the game, but it is you having a visceral, movement within the space. But Magic, its toy is a deck of cards.
Right.
That's what it relies on.
That's what it's got.
Like, it's not that exciting to shuffle, you know? So like, unless you're playing 52 pickup or something,
Right.
like there's really not a lot you can do like that feels visceral. So in order to get any sort of an emotional reaction, any chance of making it feel like thematically resonant, the actions that you're doing, you have to add meaning to these cards.
Yeah.
Right. Which is one, that's hard enough. But on top of that, you have to then do that 4 sets a year.
Right.
Right.
And make it feel different.
And make it feel different.
Right.
And they've done it.
Yeah.
Which is insane. Like,
Well,
obviously, not every set has been, you know,
Yeah.
like we talked about recently, Chroma versus Devotion. It's like,
Well, I
they
was actually just going to bring this up because
Oh, okay.
this is a perfect example of what you're talking about, in that you can see them iterating over time. Like
Right.
you can follow the footprints, right, and go, oh well, they came out with Chroma, and it didn't work, and then they came out with Devotion, and why does Devotion work and Chroma doesn't?
we should explain what Chroma and Devotion
Okay, well, Chroma, they're basically the same thing, right? They
Right.
care about how many color pips you have on a card and its mana cost, and then it gives you some kind of effect.
Right.
But Chroma wasn't normalized. Chroma was like, there's all kinds of different effects, and they care about the color pips in different ways.
Right.
And
Like reveal this many cards from your hand, and if it has that many color pips, or every creature you have on the field,
Right.
how many color pips do they have?
Right. And Devotion was like, okay, it's all color pips that you have under your control. That's it.
Yeah.
And that's what it cares about. And once you make that shift, it makes it so one, the flavor's better, but it also just helps you grok what it does, right? Like, oh, I can now wrap my head around what Devotion is because it's always the same.
Yeah.
Yeah. So and you know, we can see this also with Ward. Now it's Ward. Previous to that was Hexproof. Previous to that was Shroud. We can see them changing, sort of working up the chain in terms of allowing interaction, right? And now we have this spectrum of interaction instead of Shroud being nobody can interact with it, Hexproof being only I can interact with it if it's my creature, my opponent cannot, and Ward being my opponent can interact with it if they pay the cost. And you can see like, oh, okay, well this is ways of creating more interesting interactions in the game, where if it's Shroud, nobody interacts with it. That's much less interesting than
Right.
Ward, because now you have so many, like, oh, okay, well now I need to consider, do I want to pay the cost, rather than it just not being an option.
Yeah.
And so, like, looking at what the Magic has done over time in that way helps you wrap your head around, like, oh, well, there's a reason why they did this, for one. And if you can sort of, sometimes you can even come to your own conclusions, and they might even be different reasons than what Wizards did these things for.
Yeah.
But that informs your design perspective as like, okay, well, obviously they, you know, these professional game designers that have been working on this game for 30 years have decided that this is something that is worth pursuing and changing because it was creating some kind of consequence. And they think that moving in this direction is fixing whatever problem that it had created.
Right.
And you can do that with everything in the game.
Mark Rosewater recently had a podcast episode called The Question. And he talked about the Great Designer Search. Okay. And what he was talking about initially, it's not really getting so much into the specific question. It's a very interesting episode. So I'd recommend that you listen to it. But he talks about why they had the Great Designer Search, and they had it because it's easy to find designers that I shouldn't say easy, but it's easier to find people that can make games. I think that's maybe a good way of putting it. Mm-hmm. But it's very difficult to find designers. And there's plenty of pro players, right? There's plenty of people that can play at this highly competitive level, that understand things on a strategic level, that are very smart. They're good at math. I don't know. Lots of stuff like that, right?
Good at Magic.
Good at Magic. But it doesn't mean that they necessarily can design, because design is taking all of these levels of experience, meta, strategy, tactics, and like I'd say all of that leads up to experience. Like experience is key. And that's the thing that I think most people, that's the pinnacle. That's the thing you're always trying to strive for. And And I think that's why they end up doing the great designer search, is because they often find that they have a lot of applicants that come in they're very good at making a game, but not necessarily facilitating an experience. But I think Magic has done a fantastic job of all of those things being under the umbrella of experience. And for 30 years is like, it's the only game to have done that as far as I am concerned.
Right. I do think that's the switch that gets flipped, right? Is that when you go from I'm playing a game to win the game to I'm playing the game to create an experience.
Yeah.
And Commander does a good job of flipping that switch.
Yeah.
And so I think that what I would want people to take away from this video is that if game design is something that you feel like you might want to do or try, that you should do it, especially if you've played Magic. And if you haven't, you should play Magic.
Give it a shot. Yeah.
And that, there's a reason why so many game designers look to Magic and cite Magic as being, something that influences them or that they appreciate and they have admiration for.